Hello and welcome once more to the World Builder Wiki video series. In this third step we'll be looking at territory and we'll advance through the basic steps all the way to the more advanced. This video tutorial will cover territory in more depth than the written wiki this time around, so remember to visit this video later if you choose not to follow the more advanced steps. Territory within Company of Heroes 2 represents probably the backbone of the entire economy and the way that the game works. The economy itself and the territory is built using territory points or territory flags, and usually victory point games are also covered within territory themselves as well. What we'll be focusing on at the beginning of this video will be the basic territory layout that will usually be expected on most maps. This will include a very basic layout and will not usually have any form of cutoffs or design. Once this territory layout has been created, however, we'll start looking at how to manipulate and adapt your territory layout so that it can be customized and create a unique feel for every single map. In the final part of this video, we will also have a look at how to create the more advanced steps, how to change capture areas, and what types of flags should go where. Hopefully by the end of this tutorial, brief as it may be, you should have an idea of how to design your own map. But the thing to remember and take away from this is that every single map's territory sector layout is very different, and you can easily find character in maps based on their territory layout. Here we are back where we left off on 2-player Flood. At the moment, our map has very little in the way of gameplay assets. Where we left it, we currently have map entry points, which are over here beyond the out of bounds. We also have the HQ markers, and we also have the HQ territory flags. Now, the idea with this is you can play the map as it is, because if you go over onto the territory editor, which is up on your toolbar, which says TER, it will show you that the map is split evenly between the two teams. The blue represents one team and the green represents the second. However, what we'll look at is how to add other flags to this and how to separate these colours even more. If you have already played Company of Heroes 1 or 2, you'll know that the HQ areas of the two enemies are never touching each other. There's always a very large collection of territory between them, and it's capturing that territory that gives you your economy. So what we'll have to focus on to begin with is how to plan out our area and where to put flags. On the written wiki already, we've covered the fact that there are usually 10 normal territory points on every single map. There are 2 munitions points, 2 fuel points, and more often than not, 3 victory points. Now the layout and location of those flags is entirely up to you. If we put our grid back on using the overlay, we can start looking at how to design our map itself. And what we'll need for this will be the Spline Tool once more. Whereas splines themselves don't actually influence the territory at all, we can use them as a bit of a guideline. Once the territory editor is in place, it is quite difficult to see what's going on because of the amount of bright colours. And although you can usually change the settings to reduce the amount of bloom and the obnoxious colours that come up, usually you can work with it as long as you have a basic guideline to work from. So, once again, if we go back on textures and we scroll down, what we'll be looking for this time is under the folder NMUI. Now this one in particular is called dotted line. If we hit assign, we can start using the right click to place several nodes in an area around the HQ. Now if you remember, we talked about the idea that the HQ areas themselves usually should be set within a 64 meters squared area so that units have an opportunity to move around them. So if we box that area off roughly, we know where territory shouldn't be going. Now, personally, what I choose to do normally before I even think about placing territory flags is to come up with a very rough layout. So, for the sake of keeping things nice and easy, let's make a mirrored approach to territory here. So, let's have another 64 meters square in the northern corner and another 64 meters square in the southern corner. We can then have this very center area, which is also boxed up. Don't worry about it being rough, because these lines won't be here in the actual finished product. And then let's split the map nicely right down the middle. So already we have this concept of having 3 highly contested areas between our 2 enemies, and then a perfectly centered line. What you'll also tend to find on a lot of 2-player maps is that the HQ areas themselves should be cut off, or should be able to be cut off. So if we go for the idea of having 2 territory areas that link up with the center, we can basically split this like that. So these 2 territory areas here, if captured, will block the player from collecting any resources. We can basically do the same thing over here. And then, of course, put this one in here. So what we have at the moment are 3 areas. We've got 4, 5, 6, 7 areas. Now, if you consider that we need 10 territory points, 3 victory points, 2 munitions, and 2 fuel, 17 areas altogether that we need to make sure we are accounted for. So we still need to put quite a few in. So, let's try and cut these areas, these large areas here, up a little bit. So if we create a thin section here, and a thin section here, we can create a larger, fatter section at the top on this part, and do an equal one here. What we've created now is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15. Which means we only need to find space for 2 more points, which should be really easy to do. What we could do is put 1 in each of these corners, so that the corners themselves are cut off. Now, if your idea of a design isn't necessarily one that's a cut-off map, that's not a problem at all. We could easily change this around. This map, as it stands, would be extremely aggressive. Players who are able to rush forward and capture these 2 points could essentially cut off all income for their players, and if we put something like a fuel point or a munitions point in these corners, they could easily be cut off by 1 other point. So aggression and speed would usually be the key on a map like this, but we're only in the early stages, and usually the territory will change as we go along. So, what we'll need to do now is go onto the object placement tool and actually grab our territory points. Once the editor has loaded up, if you go on to EBPS, which is where everything we'll use is kept, and instead of going on environment, we need to go back to gameplay folder. Scroll down to the bottom and you'll find that we've got lots of flags here, or lots of assets, sorry, called territory something. We have territory fuel and fuel point MP, munitions and munitions point MP. We have a normal territory point and a territory point MP, and so on. In order to make sure that we get this nice and clear, all of the assets here that have MP as the suffix are the ones that we need. So the fuel point MP, munitions point MP, and territory point MP are the most important ones. Try to avoid using the others because they were not originally designed for Company of Heroes 2. You'll also notice that just below that you've got victory points. And there's 3 versions of these, but the only one to use really is the normal victory point. So if we get our victory point and we place 1 there, 1 there, and 1 there by using the right click once we've selected what we want. We can also go onto the fuel points, so left click it and then right click to place it just like you would a spline. Finally, let's get our munitions points. Let's make these highly contestable. Let's make them these ones here. And then just by left clicking on the territory point MP, we can place the rest of our flags in this area. Trying to keep it even for both sides if you can. But again, this is just a bit of a rough guide. So, if we double click on all the flags that we've got, it will select all the ones of the same type. And if you happen to scroll this tool down, it will say how many objects you've got selected and what they're all called. So we have 10 territory points, 3 victory points, 2 fuel, and 2 munitions, which is the ideal setup. However, what you might find is that trying to save at this point will cause an error. I will show it to you just so you've got an example. What it says here is that there are sector creating entities, but they are already within an existing sector. Basically, this means the flags are trying to create a sector, but there isn't any territory there for them, and it won't let you save. What you will need to do is go on to the territory editor and click this button at the top called Calculate Voronoi. Now immediately you'll notice as soon as I left click this, it creates a lot of pretty colours. What this has done is create a very balanced layout for every single territory point on the field. What this will do, however, sometimes, is cause your HQ markers to sometimes be underwhelmed by some of the flags. What we'll need to do is make sure that your map entry points, your territory flags, and your HQ markers are all still within their own territory. So, let's start with that. If we zoom in on this side, we need to go on to Sample, to left click, and it will change our marker to red. If we then left click on a certain colour, this one happens to be the HQ area's territory, it'll go white. If you change the brush size to whatever you want, I'm going to change to bird's eye view here. I'm looking out for a very faint dotted line. That's the one that we placed earlier. If you left click and hold, you can paint, and I'm just going to paint in the territory area to where we need it to be. Now I might have overpainted some areas here, which is absolutely fine. But the idea is I need to make sure that my HQ markers are entirely within their own areas. If I do the same, left click sample, and then left click the right area, I can paint the territory back in, no problems. Now if you want to check whereabouts your dotted lines are, so that you don't get confused, if you go onto overlay and toggle overlay, it will briefly take you out so you know whereabouts it is. If I toggle overlay again, it will go back. So I know I've missed that corner off and I can paint that back in. So, as far as basic steps go, now I should be able to save this and I have a working territory system. What you might even notice is that some of the cutoffs still remain. However, this cutoff here that was originally going to be 2 points has become 3, and this in the corner has also become a 3-point cutoff, so it's not ideal. What we would need to do is continually shift between the overlay in order to try and find out where our area needs painting. So if I grab this colour here, I can start painting in these areas. Quite roughly to begin with, it doesn't matter too much because we can go back over and edit it as we want. Something to watch out for though is that every territory point will have 2 different colours. You can see them here on this fuel point. You've got a darker blue and then you've got a lighter blue in the middle, and that is your capture areas. There's a small button up here that says paint capturable. So if I select this one, it'll be very difficult to see, but that is still white and this is a bit of an off cream. If I click paint capturable, it will paint the capture area. Now, again, if you've played Company of Heroes 2, you should already be quite familiar with this, but every single flag will have a circle underneath it, which is where units will stand in order to capture the actual territory itself. You don't capture the territory by right-clicking on the flag and standing next to it like you used to do in Company of Heroes 1. So that means that if a flag happens to have no capturable area, they won't actually be able to capture the territory. So something you'll need to make sure you do is check all territory points after you've edited and make sure that that area, that capture area, is actually there. But what this does mean is that if I go onto the sample tool again and I choose this victory point, it will immediately go off paint capturable and I can change the shape of the capture area. I can reduce it down, I can make it very small. So when I sample another one so you can see it more clearly, I've changed the size of the capture area. You can make it as large or as small as you want. And as a bit of a rule of thumb for best practice, if you have a capture point very close to a building, you'll want to make sure that the capture area doesn't go underneath the building itself. Otherwise, units that occupy the buildings will actually be able to capture the flag without being stopped. So just something to watch out for. But what you can do in changing the capture area is make sure that it offers cover to those who are capturing it, or equally doesn't allow people who are capturing it to take cover. So you can adapt the capture areas to make some points easier or harder to take. But that's something for another day. If I reverse the steps I've just made there, what we can do now is spend some time trying to get all these laid out. Now, when we have a look for the dotted lines, it isn't always obvious where they are. There is a bit of a trick to this, and it's something that I don't believe the relic designers themselves use. It's something that I started doing a few years ago. If you go back on the toggle overlay, and let's go back to basics again. On the spline placement tool, what we can do is change these dotted lines for something different. It's not very easy to work with all the time. The dotted line works quite nicely as a rough guide. But what it will create is a texture that allows you to see things a lot better. And within that, I can show you another tool. If you go on to Scenario, which is up on your taskbar, and onto Blueprint List, this will bring up a list of everything that we've created so far, and under the ref count, it will say how many of those things you have. In this case, the dotted line, I have 19 of them. If I go on to Select Selected, it will now, underneath that, have selected with the Spline tool all of the dotted line splines. Just click that again. You can close this tool, and now I have all of them selected. It won't have selected any of the splines, just those ones. Which means we can assign whatever we want to them, and it will change them all together. So if you close down NMUI instead, let's go for Road Asphalt. And under Road Asphalt, you've got one that's called Arnhem Road Brick Narrow. If you left click that and then left click Assign, you'll notice it's very, very different. This is a much darker texture. But it also has some strange patterns to it because it's brick. If I go on to Overlay again, you can see it much, much clearer. This will be a perfect way to guide us through. We can always change it back to dotted lines. But if I go onto the Territory tool now, I should be able to change my brush size, sample what I want, and easily paint because the lines are so much more visible. So let's breeze through this. Again, it doesn't matter if these are a bit rough. It's absolutely fine. But follow the guidelines. Try to avoid painting over the capture areas instead. Leave those as they are. And we'll fill in all of the blank areas that we can. And there we have it. A thing of beauty and a very, very quick process to get a nice and simple territory layout. Zoom out and you should be able to get a good view of it. There's some areas that looks like they've been missed, which is not a problem. So although Calculate Voronoi does give you a very basic territory layout, usually if you are able to paint it yourself, you can adapt things however you want. And that, again, is just a very basic step. But we should be able to save it now. And this will be very much playable. Anyways, that's where we'll leave it for now, because territory is the only thing we really need to worry about in step 3. However, if you join us for the next video, step 4, what we'll be going over is placing basic assets like designer roads, groves, and maybe a little bit of height map editing as well, before we move on to the more advanced steps like placing buildings and other cover objects. I hope to see you all in part 4. And again, if you need any help or assistance with the rest of these, please check the comments below for the actual written wiki itself. I'll see you next time.